and gives us certifiable randomness. So I will motivate the task from the viewpoint of the device-independent paradigm. Then I will tell you the protocols that we have, which are the state of the art for this particular task. I will tell you what are the assumptions. I will tell you a quick outline of the security proof. I will tell you some open questions and future work towards quantum randomness expansion and device-independent QKD. By the way, if you have any questions, you can always interrupt me. I think it's fine. So so as you know, especially if you're working in cryptography, you know that random number generation is an important problem which has which appears as a cryptographic primitive in multiple protocols. In particular, we want to extract randomness from weak seeds. So weak seeds are sources of randomness, such as some entropy source, some changes in weather patterns, some random chaos, some random radioactive material, etc. We want to extract randomness from a public weak seed. And extracting such bits, secure, private, fully uniform bits is crucial because they're useful in public key cryptography to achieve what is called CPA security and CCA security, which are security against chosen plain text attacks and chosen ciphertext attacks. They're also useful in digital signatures, message authentication codes, and of course to provide the key in private key cryptography for achieving secure encryption. It's also well known that, that generating such private random bits, secure private fully random bits, is a very hard problem. And you can look at some of these literature, especially this paper in the Journal of Cybersecurity. You can look at how security breaches are achieved when the random bits are not perfectly random, or if some part of the randomness is known to the adversary. So of course, you're familiar with random bits as being important also in randomized algorithms, in gambling scenarios, in Monte Carlo simulations, etc. In particular, in the setting of classical cryptography, random number generation is achieved either through pseudo-RNGs, which are deterministic functions that output some bits starting from a seed, but because these are deterministic functions, the numbers only look random, so they can only offer what is called computational security, which means security against an adversary who has limited computational power. Then there are what I call hardware random number generators, which produce such seeds. So an example of a hardware random number generator in the quantum setting would be simply sending photons through a 50-50 beam splitter. But then here, of course, you have to trust that this beam splitter is 50-50 and that you're preparing single photons and so on. So in general, the main cryptographic tool in classical cryptography for extracting randomness is called seeded randomness extractor, or an independent source randomness extractor, which does the following. If you have a seed that is fully uniform, private, d-bit seed, then if you have another source of randomness, say like from chaos or radioactivity or whatever other source of randomness, say even from a beam splitter, right? You apply an extractor, which is simply a function that works on these two inputs, the seed and the weak random source, and produces output bits that you can show are almost uniform, which means they are close to, they're epsilon close to uniform. But the caveat here in the classical setting is that this works only if the source and the seed are independent from each other. So extracting randomness is only possible classically if you have two or more independent sources. Now, of course, independence of sources is impossible to check or guarantee in practice. So it's normally an assumption in classical cryptography that you have multiple independent sources. So what is the task that we have in the quantum setting in quantum cryptography is to achieve a randomness amplification, which means to have a single source of randomness and to obtain private fully random bits starting from a single source of randomness. So what does it mean? A random bit is simply an unbiased bit, but also it's uncorrelated with any system held by an adversary. It means it's not only does it look random, but it's also completely uncorrelated, independent from anything that is held by an adversary. As an initial weak source, the single weak source, like I said, you can have various sources of randomness, just thermal noise, etc., or fluctuations in light. Such weak sources, you can model them in general as a min-entropy source, which is just a string of bits that has some randomness, that has some entropy, or else you can consider that the source has some more structure to it, and such a structure is called a Santha-Vazirani source. It's named after Miklos Santa and Umesh Vazirani. And the idea is that you can have that these are strings of bits x1 to xn, such that the probability of any bit being equal to 0 or 1 is epsilon, at most epsilon away from uniform, which means even if you know all the bits that came before, and even if there is any other random variable that is correlated with the source, any other information that you may have about the source, the probability of guessing this bit value is bounded as an epsilon away from uniform. This epsilon is a parameter that describes the bias of the RNG. So in terms of this Santha-Vazirani sources, the task of randomness amplification is that you're given a single such source, which has some epsilon in between 0 and half, and you want to achieve epsilon, final epsilon going to 0, which means you want to get fully random bits. And this task is well known to be classically impossible. You can look at this paper from 1984 that proves this idea, that if you have a single weak source, it's not possible to extract any randomness. So there is no classical function that can produce even a single output bit, which has epsilon f less than epsilon, which means that you cannot improve the randomness of a single source with any classical hashing function. So the task turns out to be quantumly possible, and that's the topic of my talk today. Especially, it also turns out to be possible in the setting of device independence. So just in case some of you have not heard about device independence, let me just briefly tell you that device independence is the highest form of security that you can have, in the sense that you can get information-theoretic security even if the users do not trust the workings of a device. So device independence you can motivate from a few different directions. One is to certify the randomness, that it's not just enough to pass some statistical randomness tests. You also want to say that this is purely random. It has intrinsic randomness that is like the randomness that we get from quantum systems. Secondly, that you want to trust that the bits that you get are truly random from the point of view of any adversary. Now, if you think of a classical system like a classical random number generator, well, it produces some output bits that look uniform. They may even pass some statistical tests, but it could simply be the case that the provider of this random number generator has already generated these random numbers, and this device is simply spitting them out from a classical memory. Which means that if you look at these bits, if you look at the bits from a classical random number generator, they will pass the test, they look random to the user, but of course they are perfectly predictable to the advisor, to the adversary, or to the provider of this device. And a third reason why device-independent cryptography is important is because quantum random number generators, even the ones that are commercially available, you can only say that they produce you random bits if they are working as per specifications. And it's very well possible that the random number generator over time may deviate from intended designs due to imperfections or aging or accidental failures or simply tampering by an adversary. So in all of this idea, we want the notion of device-independent cryptography, which is information processing where the users do not need to trust the internal workings of a quantum device. So that's the idea, that we are classical users. We want to deal with the device as a black box, interact with it classically, and certify randomness based solely on the input-output statistics from the device, which means we usually test for the violation of a Bell inequality. So that's the idea of device independence. Here, the adversary, an eavesdropper, may have even prepared the devices that the honest parties use. The eavesdropper may have some other quantum or no signaling systems that are correlated with the devices. It may even be correlated with the initial weak seed. So the idea is that quantum physics, in spite of giving this much power to the adversary, still allows you to extract randomness from single weak seeds. And eavesdropper here is only bound by the laws of physics, either by just quantum mechanics or simply only by the impossibility of faster than light signaling, which is the axiom of relativity. So how do we quantify the final security? Is usually by just asking for what's called universally composable security, which is the idea that the output bits of our protocol must look uniform and independent from Eve, which means that they should be indistinguishable from being uniform, fully random, and independent from any eavesdropper. So this, I stress, is not computational security. It's the highest form of information-theoretic security. And this device-independent paradigm works under the idea of quantum non-locality, which, as hopefully all of you know, is the idea that well, correlations between outcomes of measurements on entangled states violate Bell inequality, which you know that there's a loophole-free test, which won the Nobel Prize last year. And it essentially tells us that quantum measurement outcomes are not predetermined. They have some intrinsic randomness, and we can hope to exploit this feature of quantum mechanics to extract purely random bits. So that's the motivation. The idea in this talk will be to essentially say that, well, we are working in the device-independent paradigm where we do not trust anything about the state of the devices. We do not trust that the state of the devices is as prepared. There is some specific quantum state. We don't need anything of it. We don't need to trust the specific measurements. We don't need to trust that Alice or Bob are performing sigma Z, sigma X, etc. We don't even need to trust the dimensionality of the Hilbert space of the systems. We don't need to trust the random number generator that normally in device-independent QKD, you have some trust in the random number generator. In this protocol, we will not trust any random number generator. And the only thing we will trust is that there is no information leakage from the measurement unit, which means to say that we want that the device simply does not broadcast the output bits directly to the adversary. So we don't want the device to simply tell the adversary what our outputs are. There are some other certain assumptions in device independent, that there is some trusted classical processing, there's an authenticated classical channel, which are certain other assumptions that we are also working to remove in the future. But for this talk, I will just be focusing on the random number generation. So that's the task. The idea is to extract randomness from a single weak seed. In particular, we want that the weak seed is publicly available, which means that after this seed is used in the protocol, the adversary can come to know about these seed bits, which means that these seed bits could be some public things like weather patterns or thermal noise or something like the NIST randomness beacon, which if you go to this website, you can see that you can extract, that you can get a seed value which has some amount of randomness to it. An adversary can, of course, come to know these seed bits after they are used in the protocol. So that's the task that we're looking at, extracting randomness from a single weak public seed. And as I told you, you can either model the seed as a Santha-Vazirani source or more generally as a min-entropy source. So what's the difference between the two? Well, in a min-entropy source, you have, we call it an NK min-entropy source, which means we have an n-bit string that has conditional min-entropy k, which means that the probability of guessing this n-bit string is less than or equal to 2 to the minus k. So k is some number between 0 and n. The larger the k, the more the entropy in this, more the randomness in this bit string. So that's just a simple way to understand a min-entropy source. The difference between a min-entropy source and the Santha-Vazirani source, which I talked about earlier, is that in the Santha-Vazirani source, each bit has some randomness. So each bit has some unpredictability, even after knowing all the previous bits. Each bit still has some epsilon amount of randomness to it. Whereas in the general case, a min-entropy source is just an n-bit string about which is not fully deterministic. In this particular talk, I will be talking about the block min-entropy source, which is somewhat intermediate between the Santha-Vazirani source and the min-entropy source. A block min-entropy source is a distribution, say x equal x1, x2, which means you have two n bits. You have x1, which is an n-bit string, x2 is another n-bit string. And the idea is that x1 has some min-entropy k1, which means that the adversary, who has some classical side information lambda, which means adversary has some classical variable that is correlated with x1. Adversary, the maximum probability with which adversary can guess x1 is less than or equal to 2 to the minus k1. And similarly, x2 has some min-entropy k2, even conditioned upon x1 and lambda, which means even if the adversary comes to know the value of x1, and even if she has some other classical side information, she can still only guess x2 with probability 2 to the minus k2. So that's called a block min-entropy source. It's 2 n bits. Each block of n bits has some min-entropy. So I stress again that x1 and x2 here are not independent. They're correlated, but they're correlated up to this condition here. And classically, again, it's not possible to extract randomness from a Santha-Vazirani source, from a single Santha-Vazirani source, or a block entropy source, or a min-entropy source. You generally need a lot of independent sources to extract randomness from. And the idea is that in quantum mechanics, you can do that if you have just a single source. So this is state of the art of this task. It was first studied by Kolbeck and Renner in this Nature Physics paper in 2012. They worked in the setting of a no signaling adversary, which means that an adversary who is only restricted by the no signaling principle of relativity, by the impossibility of superluminal communication. And the seed that they consider is this Santha-Vazirani source, where each bit has some epsilon amount of randomness. The epsilon was kind of very small. This protocol was not very robust, which means it has vanishing robustness. If there is some noise, the noise goes as 1 over n. Typically, we want constant rate of noise to have an experimentally feasible protocol. The number of devices means the number of parties that you need, the number of components to the device. Typically, because we are using device independence, you need at least 2 separated, 2 shielded components in order to extract randomness, in order to do a device independent protocol. So those are the parameters. In this talk, I will tell you mainly about this work where we're talking about a quantum adversary. The difference between a quantum adversary and a no signaling adversary is that a quantum adversary may have some entangled systems that are correlated with the device, but she's restricted by the laws of quantum mechanics. Adversary is restricted by the laws of quantum mechanics, which means she cannot prepare general no signaling distributions such as PR boxes, if you know that. So adversary here is restricted by the laws of quantum mechanics. We're going to be talking about a block H-min source, which, as I said, has 2 blocks. Each block has some min-entropy. We have a protocol that has a constant amount of constant rate of robustness, which means that it tolerates constant rate of noise. It has 2 devices. And we'll come to the idea of a Markov chain in a bit. So those are these papers. You can look at some of these papers to see what is the state of the art in the field. So as you can see, if you compare this list, this protocol would be the state of the art. It's also the latest protocol in this direction. So what's the schematic? What's the general idea? Is that you have a user, which is Alice and Bob. They have an imperfect RNG, which is like a seed that may have been prepared by the adversary. The adversary may also have some side information that is correlated with this RNG. They use these bits from the RNG as inputs into a quantum device. They do not know the internal workings of the device. They treat the device as a black box. The device itself may have been prepared by the adversary, and adversary may even have some quantum side information about the device, which means adversary may have some entangled systems that are correlated with the state of the device. So what's the idea? That we use these input bits to choose measurement settings in a Bell test. We run it on this quantum device. We perform a verification procedure, which means we test for the violation of some Bell inequality. And we get the outputs of this device. We do some additional post-processing, maybe together with some additional bits from the RNG, and we produce the final output bit, which we want to prove is obeys this universally composable security, which means it's completely independent and uniform from the point of view of a general quantum adversary. So you see that here we have a lot of power to the adversary, and we are working in a fully device-independent setting where very little is trusted, other than the fact that these devices are shielded there. They obey the locality condition in Bell non-locality. So let me just tell you not these results. I'll just tell you this particular result, which is the latest in this direction, which is saying that if I have a 2-block min entropy source, where the blocks have sufficiently high min entropy, I'll tell you what this sufficiently high means in a moment. We have a protocol, a device-independent protocol, which has a 2-component device, which means there are 2 shielded parts to this device that obeys the soundness and completeness criteria of security. Soundness means that if the device does not abort, which means either the protocol aborts with high probability, or if the protocol does not abort, an epsilon close to uniform string R is produced, which means that security you can achieve if the protocol does not abort. On the other hand, you have completeness condition. The completeness condition says that there is an honest implementation of the device such that the protocol aborts with negligible probability. So you putting these are standard statements of security in a cryptographic protocol, that there is an honest implementation that does not abort the protocol, and provided the protocol does not abort, you can get an epsilon close to uniform string from the point of view of an adversary, even given the adversary's quantum side information. So that's the result that I'm going to talk about. There are some other results in the direction of no signaling adversaries. No signaling adversaries are usually harder to deal with because we do not have the entire formalism of quantum mechanics. We have to rely solely on the statistics and prove things against just general no signaling boxes. So those are slightly more difficult to deal with. So that's the result I'm going to talk about. It's an amplification protocol for a single block min entropy source using quantum resources in the device-independent setting against a quantum adversary. So let me state exactly what are the assumptions. The adversary here is limited by quantum mechanics in this particular protocol for the min entropy source, which means that the adversary holds a purification of the quantum state of the device held by the honest player. So Alice and Bob hold these devices, and adversary holds a purification of the quantum state of the device, which means adversary has some quantum system that is entangled with the device held by the honest players. Adversary also holds classical side information about the min entropy source. The min entropy source is public, which means that after the bits are used, adversary comes to know about these bits. But adversary in classical side information about this min entropy source, which adversary has a classical random variable that she can use to guess the bits that are being produced. So that's the lambda that's in the definition of the min entropy source. Now you might also ask what happens if the seed itself is a quantum seed, like we use an ID quantic random number generator that is obviously produced by a quantum process. So what if the seed itself is a quantum, if the source itself is quantum, what if the adversary also holds some quantum system that is entangled with the source? That's called quantum side information about the source. So there are two things to distinguish here. There's quantum side information about the device and quantum side information about the source. In this work, we're going to be talking about quantum side information about device and classical side information about source, which means that the adversary holds a quantum system that is correlated with the state of Alice and Bob, but she only has classical side information about the source, which means she only has a classical random variable that she can use to guess the source bits. She doesn't have quantum side information about the source. So that's something to note. So there are some forthcoming work in which we talk about both quantum side information about both source and device, in which we will model the source and device both as quantum systems with the adversary holding a general purification of both the device and the source. So we have a general quantum state of the source of Alice and Bob's device and eavesdropper's quantum system. So that's the general idea, but in this talk, I'm going to be working in this blue picture in which we have Alice and Bob. They're going to use this weak source to choose measurement settings in a Bell test. Here is modeled as a CHSH test, but we will use a different Bell inequality here. We have adversary who has some quantum system that's correlated with the device of Alice and Bob, and adversary is trying to guess the outcome, say, of Alice or Bob. In this case, you can formulate the probability of adversary guessing Alice's outcome in terms of what's called a semi-definite program, which is to ask what is the maximum probability with which adversary can guess the value of Alice's outcome, provided the marginal distribution of Alice and Bob's device is some specific observed distribution that is quantum. So you can approximate it by a semi-definite program through a hierarchy of semi-definite relaxations to the quantum set that was discovered a long time ago by Navasquez, Pironio, and Assin. So you can read more about these things in my supervisor's paper, my postdoc supervisor Pironio's paper in Nature. So that's the assumption, the first two assumptions. The third assumption is that the device has two separated shielded components, which is needed in order to run the Bell test. The fourth assumption is that the source, the seed that we are using, is a two-block source. Specifically, the first block has quite high mean entropy of order n to the alpha for alpha less than or equal to 1, which means it's, remember that I said that k is in between 0 and n. And the larger the k, the more the randomness in the source. So k1 here is quite large. K2 is even larger, it's linear in n. So it's greater than or equal to half plus delta prime times n, where delta prime is some constant here. It's actually, well, 16 over 32 is a typo here, but yeah, so that's the K2. It's both of these are quite high blocks of mean entropy. The final assumption is called the Markovian assumption, which says that the mean entropy source and the device can be correlated, but any correlations between the source and the device are due to the past events, which means they are due to any interactions between the two, and they are correlated up to eavesdropper side information, which means that the mutual information between the device and the block mean entropy source conditioned upon lambda and E. Remember, lambda is the classical side information that eavesdropper holds about the source. E is the quantum side information that eavesdropper holds about the device. Conditioned upon the eavesdropper side information, the correlations disappear, which means that the device and the source are conditionally independent, conditioned upon eavesdropper side information. This is a model that's called the Markov model that enables use of what are called quantum proof multi-source extractors. So we come to that, the idea of the Markovian assumption is that adversary here has some classical side information about the source. It's lambda or hedge, whatever we call it. Adversary has some quantum side information about the device. And given lambda and E, the mean entropy source and device are independent. That's the assumption, well, the Markovian assumption. And recently, people were able to prove the security against quantum adversary of multi-source randomness extractor in this Markovian model. So you can look at this paper by Arnold Friedman, Portman, and Scholz, where this particular model was considered and extractors were proven to be quantum secure in this model. So those are the assumptions in the protocol. So now, so that's the result. Those are the assumptions. I can now tell you a little bit about the protocol and what is the idea of security here. If you have any questions, of course, feel free to stop me at this point. So that's the main message that I wanted to give, that we have this device independent protocol that works under these assumptions and extracts randomness from a single block mean entropy source. Okay, so let's try to go through this protocol step by step, and we can see if we follow. So the idea is that we have this two block mean entropy source. There's x1 and x2. x1 is n bits that has a mean entropy k1. The first step in the protocol is to apply the Trevisan extractor, just which was produced by Luca Trevisan in this paper in 2001. It's proven to be quantum secure. It's called this extractor sub T. We apply the extractor to X1 together with every possible string of length D. So what is the idea here? So remember, extractors are classical functions that produce you output bits that are uniform, provided you give them two independent sources, or you give them a seed that is uniform and a source that is independent from the seed. Now, what we do is we apply this extractor to X1 and enumerate every possible seed of length D. So you have 2 to the D possible seeds of length D. We produce random variables S1, S2, all the way to S2 to the D. That's the first step. So we apply extractor to X1, J. J goes from 1 to 2 to the D. This procedure produces M bits output. We do a second classical processing procedure in which we choose the first log n bits from S1, call it S1 prime. Similarly, choose the first log n bits from S2, call it S2 prime, etc. That's an idea that does the following, that produces these output strings S1 prime, S2 prime, all the way to S2 to the D prime, that have this property that they have a full support on all 2 to the n prime bit strings, which means the following, that in this procedure, what we are doing is we are getting output bits S1, S2, all the way to S2 to the D, because the extractor is designed to produce output bits that are epsilon close to uniform, provided you have independence. Intuitively, you can understand that if you enumerate all possible seeds, there must be at least one J in this string of S1, S2, all the S2 to the D, such that Sj, this Sj star has is epsilon away from uniform. Because the extractor is able to extract randomness if you have independent seeds, if you don't have an independent seed, you simply enumerate everything and you can guarantee that at least one of the positions has epsilon amount of randomness. The second step of this classical procedure of choosing the log n bits further does the processing that not only do we get a string that is epsilon away from uniform, but also it has full support, which means that every string of length m prime has a non-zero probability of appearing. So that's called, if you know about such things, in such a case, the extractor acts as an epsilon disperser for this parameter value log n. So this step, this idea is called constructing a somewhere random source. It has been used in the literature on randomness extractors, both classically and quantumly. The idea is to produce a quantum somewhere random source where if you have a CQ state row in which you have S1 to S2 to the D, which are classical bits, and you have E, which is some quantum state, the CQ state with these classical bits and quantum E is a somewhere random source against E if there is some index I such that row at this position, the state of this SIE is a uniform bit string of length M, tensor row E, which means that you get at this position I, you get a bit string that is uniform and is independent from an eavesdropper. We'll also say that it's 2 to the D M epsilon quantum somewhere random source if there's exists an I such that this is not fully uniform but is epsilon away from uniform. So so that's a classical procedure. We can prove in this first step that in this bit strings that we have S1 prime, S2 prime, all the way to S2 to the D prime, there is somewhere in one of these positions, we do not know where because we do not have much information about X1, but we can prove that at least one of these bit strings is has this amount of randomness, is epsilon away from uniform, and moreover, it is a full support bit string, which means that every bit string of this length has a non-zero probability of appearing. So that's the first technical step that produces such a string. So now we have m prime times 2 to the d bits, out of which we have some block of m prime bits that are epsilon away from uniform. The second step in this protocol is to use these 2 to the d times m prime bits as the inputs in the Bell test. And specifically, we will run a Bell test that is based on the Hardy paradox, which you may have heard about. It's one of the manifestations of quantum non-locality. So importantly, when you run a Bell test, you need to choose the measurement settings with some randomness. That's the measurement independence assumption. So we use these in bits that we get to choose the inputs in this particular Bell test. We call it an MDL Hardy gain. I'll come to what is MDL in a moment. Importantly, we run this in sequence. So the first block, we use the first S1 prime to choose the measurement settings in block 1. We choose S2 prime, which is another block of M prime bits to choose the measurement settings in the block 2, and so on until the 2 to the d block, where we will use the bits from S2 to the d prime to choose the measurement settings. And we record all the outputs in each of these runs. Importantly, this is done in sequence with just 2 spatially separate devices. And because this Hardy paradox works in the 2 input setting, we need each player to have a single bit. So if we have m prime bits, then we can run m prime over 2 runs within a single block. So there are 2 to the d times m prime over 2 runs in this whole protocol. That's the protocol step 2. The third step is the estimation procedure. The players test for the violation of this Hardy parameter in each of these 2 to the d blocks, which means they test the average value of a particular Bell type parameter, which we call the MDL Hardy parameter. And they check that this violation is greater than some delta for some fixed constant delta. They abort the protocol even if one of these blocks, if this condition is not satisfied. So they abort the protocol if the violation is not sufficient even in one of the blocks. Okay, so they check for each of the blocks and they check that there is sufficient violation in all of the blocks. So at this point, I have to tell you what is the game and what is the idea of this Hardy parameter and this MDL Hardy parameter. Now, we might know that in a one of the assumptions in Bell theorem is measurement independence, which means that the measurement settings must be chosen independently of the quantum state of the entangled state. So that's called measurement independence. In 2014, the group of Jisan designed an inequality that they call the measurement-dependent locality inequalities. They are designed to detect non-locality even in the situation when perfect measurement independence does not hold, which means that when the measurement inputs are not perfectly uniform, but they have some epsilon amount of randomness, you can still detect non-locality if you use a modified version of a Bell inequality that they call the MDL inequality. So in this particular case, we are using this MDL Hardy inequality. So in each round, each player receives a single bit input XY in 0, 1, produces a single bit output AB in 0, 1. And the goal of the players is to maximize this MDL Hardy parameter, which is defined in terms of a joint probability distribution of outputs and inputs, like so, with epsilon being H being half plus epsilon and L being half minus epsilon. So that's the definition of the parameter that we're going to test. Now we might know that classically you can prove quite easily that for local hidden variable theories, this quantity is bounded by 0, whereas a quantum strategy exists to achieve these 3 probabilities to be 0, while this probability is not 0, which means that you can achieve m epsilon greater than 0 in quantum mechanics. So this is one of the ways to detect non-locality in the situation where you do not have perfect randomness, but you have some epsilon amount of randomness. And we quantify this randomness in the outputs in each run in terms of the what's called the conditional von Neumann entropy of the output condition on Eve's side information. The idea is that, well, we have Alice and Bob that are performing these measurements and getting some outputs. There is some behavior that is characterized by the joint, by the probability of the outputs conditioned upon the inputs. And you can ask what is the maximum probability in each round with which Eve can guess Alice's outcome. Such a quantity is called the guessing probability, which is based on a general strategy for an eavesdropper, a quantum eavesdropper who may hold it. So there's a tripartite quantum state of Alice, Bob, and eavesdropper on some composite Hilbert space, arbitrary dimensions. We do not know anything about the state. We have some POVM that Alice measures on her system, and similarly Bob measures some POVM, and similarly eavesdropper measures POVM on her system to try to guess Alice's outcome. And in this case, the guessing probability is written like such an expression that we ask what is the maximum probability which eavesdropper can guess Alice's outcome, provided the marginal distribution of Alice and Bob is as observed. And as I said before, this quantity, this guessing probability, can be approximated to a good degree by a semi-definite program. And a negative log of this quantity gives a lower bound on this on the entropy that we generate in the outputs per round. So we can show that in each run, the outputs, even conditioned upon the inputs and conditioned upon the side information of the eavesdropper, the outputs have some amount of mean entropy that we can quantify in these terms. Where, as I said, epsilon is a parameter that appears at the first step of the protocol. It's a parameter in this first procedure that we get, that each of these S1 prime, etc., that there is some Sj prime that is epsilon away from uniform. That's that parameter. And this small h denotes the binary entropy. So you can have a single round bound. So we can certify the randomness in a single round. And what about all the rounds? What's the total amount of entropy that we get in all the rounds? Now, if you have what's called an IID situation, an independent, identically distributed situation, then of course the total entropy simply adds up. However, we do not have such a thing. We have a general quantum adversary who holds, and all of these measurements are performed in sequence, so they may not be IID. So we don't have any such assumption. In such a situation, there is a beautiful result due to Dupuy, Fauzi, and Renner, who proved what's called the entropy accumulation theorem, that states that even though we do not have an IID situation, the total entropy still accumulates sort of linearly with some corrections. So the proposition we can prove is that if you have a rho, which is the state of the devices, and eavesdropper at the end of the n runs of the protocol, suppose that the complement of perp denotes the event of not aborting, and rho is conditioned upon this is the state condition on not aborting the protocol, then either the protocol aborts with high probability, or it holds that the outputs, the entire output string, has some smooth min entropy that is of the order of m prime. So let me remind you that this m prime is just one of these blocks, right? So one of these blocks is of size m prime over 2. Now, because we only have randomness in one of these Sj primes, therefore we can only get randomness from that particular block. We can only get randomness from the outputs of that particular block, because the rest of these inputs may not have randomness, which means that even if the outputs look random, they may have been generated by a deterministic procedure. So this is simply because in a Bell test, if the inputs are not chosen randomly, then you can simulate the Bell violation using a local hidden variable model. So that's the idea. So therefore, the total output entropy in all of these outputs is only of the order of the number of bits in a single block. So you say that this is of the order of m prime. Don't know how much time I have. Do you have like 5-10 minutes more?
10 minutes.
Okay. So there's a sketch of proof. Maybe I will skip the idea. I'll just tell you that the entropy accumulation theorem, you have to construct a min trade-off function and show that under these assumptions of this Markov model, etc., that that the total amount of entropy in this particular block, this particular chosen block, is linear in the size of that block. And for the rest of the blocks, we simply have to use the non-negativity of the smooth mean entropy, the classical variables, and the chain rule for smooth mean entropy to show that the total entropy in all of these output bits is still of the same order as in this particular block. So I'll skip the details of this proof. I'll go to the last step of this protocol, which is the step 4. Remember, I said that the block min entropy source has 2 blocks, and x1 and x2. Now, what we did is to use x1. We did some classical procedure. We did a Bell test, and we got outputs A and B, A and Bn, which we showed have some amount of min entropy, which is smooth mean entropy, which is of the order of n prime. Now we take the second block of n bits from the 2-block min entropy source, along with Alice and Bob's output bit strings, and we use them as inputs to Raz's extractors, another independent source extractor that works on this x2 along with the output bits from this Bell test in order to produce the final output bits. So of course, these output bits, you have to certify that they are random based on this Bell test, this MDL-Hardy test. If they don't satisfy, then you abort the protocol. If they do satisfy, then you go ahead with this final extraction procedure. Now, the details of that is that, well, we know that from this entropy accumulation statement, we know that the outputs have entropy of the order of m prime. The second block of n bits also has sufficiently high min entropy, which, as we said, is linear in n. We use Raz's independent source extractor that works for this particular parameter range. And under this Markovian assumption that the x2 and the device, the source and the device are conditionally independent, conditioned upon eavesdropper side information, we can apply this Raz's extractor to get the final output bits. We prove the soundness statement for a composable security. Composable security simply means that you can use these output bits in further cryptographic protocols. So they're composable, meaning that you can use them in further cryptographic protocols without any loss in parameters. So the statement is that the amplification protocol outputs a string of length m is said to be epsilon f secret if this condition holds 1 minus probability of abort times the distance of the output bits from the joint state of output bits and eavesdropper is close to the uniform bit string uncorrelated with eavesdropper. And we can prove that this condition holds for choice of epsilons and gammas. We show that this final epsilon is arbitrarily close to 0. So that's a soundness statement. Secondly, we can prove a completeness statement, which, as I said, there is an ideal Hardy state, a non-maximally entangled 2-qubit state, if you perform measurements on that state for those n runs, then you can show that this MDL-Hardy parameter will be greater than some fixed delta for all these runs. So we can prove a completeness theorem that the probability that the protocol aborts for an honest implementation with this particular state and measurements is probability that the protocol aborts is negligible, which means that there is an honest implementation such that the protocol does not abort. So that's this outline of the security of this protocol. So I hope that was kind of clear. One last point I wanted to make is that apart from the cryptographic implementation implications, there are also foundational implications for freedom of choice in fundamental physics. So some of you may know about some some discussions over the past years by Hossein Felder and other people that are talking about a super deterministic interpretation of Bell non-locality. So what's the idea? So can we certify the existence of a truly random process in nature? No, you cannot if the world is fully deterministic. So if the inputs, outputs, everything is deterministic, if there is no seed to begin with, then, well, there is no output you can certify, right? So in Bell non-locality, you need to have inputs chosen at least with a little amount of randomness in order to certify the randomness in the outcomes. So even Bell theorem certifies randomness in the measurement outcomes only if the inputs have some randomness to them. So if the world is fully deterministic, we cannot certify any truly random process. However, suppose there is a small amount of randomness in nature. So the statement you can show from a device-independent randomness amplification protocol in a fundamental sense is that assuming nature respects the no signaling principle, or in this case that it obeys the laws of quantum mechanics, either the world is fully deterministic, which means all inputs, everything is fully determined, or there exist in nature events that are fully random. So how you can say that is simply because we said that the seed has some amount of randomness to it. Now we have a physical procedure that is producing us finally some output bits that are arbitrarily close to uniform, which means that this is a physical process that is producing randomness, that is truly random. So either the world is fully deterministic or there exist in nature events that are fully random. So if there is a little bit of randomness in nature, then that can be amplified to a fully random process, to a fully random bit using a physical process. So that's the foundational implications towards these kind of ideas of contradicting Bell theorem through this superdeterminism. Of course, if you have superdeterminism, you cannot prove anything in Bell theorem. But if you have a little bit of randomness, then you can guarantee a fully random process in nature. So that's the idea. I hope I conveyed that part at least clearly. The idea now, there's a lot of other things to work on in this direction, which is to consider, as I said, quantum side information about the source, treat the source as, let's say, as an ID quantum random number generator, treat it as a quantum device, and consider that the eavesdropper has some entangled state that is correlated with the source. Improvement in the extraction rates to compare with more classical random. Of course, device-independent protocols have a lot of, they do not have a very high extraction rate compared to classical processes, classical random number generators. So that's a huge area to work on, improving the extraction rate and robustness of the protocol. And as I said, this work mainly concentrated on block mean entropy sources. In forthcoming work, we're trying to do more general arbitrary min entropy sources, and arbitrary adversaries are only limited by the no signaling principle. And finally, while this analysis was focused on this randomness amplification, you can also adapt it to simply do a Bell test to detect non-locality when measurement settings this time are chosen using a single min entropy source, single block min entropy source of quite small min entropy of the order of log n, where n denotes the number of test runs. So that's an idea that people have been looking at. For example, there was a big Bell test collaboration a few years ago in which people were trying to test Bell inequality in the setting in which measurement settings are chosen with humanly generated randomness. What we want to do in this setting is that suppose we just have a single min entropy source of quite small min entropy, you still want to have a Bell test to close this kind of loophole of that the measurement settings are chosen randomly. So we want to say that we choose measurement settings with arbitrarily small randomness. So that's the discussion. I have some other stories, but I think I should stop here. Just to say that there are some PhD and postdoc positions available for bright students from India. So I'm very happy to receive any information from people in this conference in this regard. So thanks a lot, and I can answer any questions you have.
Thank you, Dr. Ramanathan, for such an excellent, exciting presentation. So I would like to request the participants, if you have any questions, feel free to ask the speaker.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Thank you for your talk. In one of your slides, you were discussing about disadvantages of using device-dependent random number generator. So what about the protocols of quantum cryptography based on quantum entanglement? What is alternative of E91 protocol? Do you have any suggestion or?
So there are a lot of device-dependent protocols. And there are also some semi-device independent protocols, which also we're working on. So there are different, so as I said, in the setting of device independence, in general quantum cryptography, you have to either trust, you have to trust the source, that the state of the device is as prescribed, or you have to trust the measurements that are being performed. Or you at least have to trust the dimensionality of the system. So if you have like a single photon, you have to trust that it's a, like you have to trust that it's a single qubit system.
Mm-hmm.
So there are attacks known based on if you have if the dimension is not controlled, etc. So there are different levels of characterization of that you. I mean, the more you relax these assumptions, the higher the generation rates, the better your protocol will look in terms of noise tolerance, in terms of generation rates, etc. But this work especially is trying to do it in the most paranoid setting, in which we have no trust at all, right? So it's the highest security, where we do not have any trust on the state or the measurements or the dimension. Yeah, there is very little trust. The only, as I said, there are only the few assumptions that we make, which is just that we can do a Bell test. So there are these devices from QIQT, for example, that you can purchase. We even purchased in the lab here in Hong Kong for a few thousand euros, etc. Yeah, those are, of course, you have to trust that they're working according to specifications. And they are good for some tasks, but people are interested in doing more device independent stuff now. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So any suggestion regarding E91 protocol? Because I heard that random number generator is not preferable as compared to E91. So in your case, you are talking about device independent. So do you have anything in your mind which can be used as replacement for E91 protocol or quantum entanglement?
Yes. So the next step, this was one of the things I have slides for it. So the idea is to, so this, at this step, we are only generating random bits. The next step is to do QKD, right? So QKD is when you have, not only you have random bits, but you have Alice and Bob have perfectly correlated bits. So there are some additional steps you have to do. Here we are only generating random bits in a single lab with two separated components. So if you want to do a DIQKD experiment, so there was a paper in Nature last year where they had a device-independent quantum key distribution experiment. And this is also being done in China in Jian Wei Pan's group. They have a lot of progress in device-independent QKD. In those protocols, though, they still use, to choose the measurement settings, they still use an ID quantic random number generator. So they still have to trust that the measurement settings are chosen with an ideal quantum random number generator. So this line of work is trying to remove this assumption in the DIQKD. So the next step is, as you say, to expand this to a device-independent QKD setting. So we want to move to QKD setting where you can extract key for Alice and Bob, not only just random bits, perfectly correlated random bits between Alice and Bob that can be far away from each other and in a device-independent way with a good secret key rate against different powers of adversaries like quantum or no signaling. So we have some protocols that we're working on in QKD, but for the moment, we only have the randomness amplification protocol.
Yeah. Thank you.
I have a question. Like this completely device independent involves Bell tests. There is a mention about semi-device independent scenarios. Does it involve steering tests or something else? Just I need to clarify that.
That's a good question. So, here there are. So you can either trust a source. So there are what's called measurement device independent protocols, which are being worked on by Professor Hoi Kwang Lo, who was here for a while in Hong Kong. Then there are semi-device independent protocols where you trust the dimensionality of a system. So this is based on some prepare and measure scenarios. There are also one-sided device independent protocols that are based on steering, as you say. So we also have a steering-based paper, this paper here, for sources against no signaling adversary. So we consider a setting in which Alice's device is trusted to be quantum. It's not trusted to have specific qubit or specific state. It's just trusted to be quantum. And Bob is a general no signaling device, and eavesdropper is a general no signaling adversary. So that is called a one-sided no signaling, one-sided device independent scenario. Sorry, not no, one-sided device independent scenario. So that's a protocol that we have in this paper. You can take a look if you're interested. So indeed, in one-sided device independence, you can solve some problems that are not possible in device independence because you have more power over your system. So if one of the systems is quantum, we can even show that you can reach extremal points of a kind of a no signaling correlation in the one-sided setting, in the steering scenario. Whereas in Bell non-locality, we cannot reach extreme points of the no signaling polytope. Like PR boxes and things we cannot reach. But in the steering scenario, you can reach, which means that in the steering scenario, things become possible, which are not possible in the device independent scenario. Yeah. Of course, then you have additional assumptions. You can do things that are, you can improve rates, you can get other kind of protocols, etc. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Okay. So I thank you once again, Dr. Ramanathan, for such an exciting talk. So hereby we conclude our third talk in this session and the final talk. So I hereby conclude the session, and thanks a lot to the organizers, especially Professor Prashant Panigrahi, for giving me the opportunity to act as a session coordinator. Thank you very much. And thanks a lot to all the participants as well.
Thank you.
Okay, dear participants, an announcement for all. There will be an evening session. There will be 2 talks by Cyril Brancat and Fabrizio Toscano from 6 to 8 p.m. So I request all of you to please tune in. Thank you.